you all hanging out. Hello, welcome to the PiG Daily, episode number 72, where we are going to be talking about Zerg vs Terran, unit counters, and the common compositional adjustments that you should be making in the matchup. So this is going to be a really interesting episode where we're looking at most of all the main common compositions. Obviously, there's like limitless compositions you could technically use in Zerg vs Terran. You could play Mass, Marauder, Raven. We're not really going to talk about that specifically, and I'm also not going to go into too much detail over the really niche units, but I am going to talk mainly about the little adjustments that you're going to make on a regular basis. So Bio versus, Lingbane Muta, Roach Ravager compositions. We're going to be talking about mech towards the end a little bit as well. We're just going to go through there and have some fun talking about that. So So we are going to be focused on the current meta, going to be looking at a lot of pro games and snippets from them to show you guys some good examples. So let's start off talking about Bio as Terran. Now, Bio is the base of pretty much every army. It's just the default composition you go towards: Marines, Marauders, and Medevacs. However, actually, I was going to show you guys a really funny video first. That's right. I'm going to skip that. That's dumb. I was going to show you guys a video from Wings of Liberty of someone killing someone with mass void rays. That's really unimportant. Okay, yeah, so mass Marine Marauder. But there's a lot of adjustments. How many Marines to how many Marauders, tanks or Widow Mines, all this sort of stuff. Hellbats? Do you add Hellbats in? When do you do that? So let's take a look. First of all, game from Shoutcraft Kings. Big shout out to Total Biscuit and Blizzard, of course, for hosting this. And this is, of course, Innovation versus Solar from the other day. A really big Lingbane versus Bio game on Apotheosis. And this was like a really sick game in the Shoutcraft show matches, of course, King of the Hill format. So, first of all, Marine Marauder ratio. This is a good replay to talk about that. Now, Marauders are good at tanking versus Lingbane, but they don't really have enough damage output to be super effective. Like, Zerglings wreck Marauders really hard. So you're very reliant on the Marauders, not really in an insane count when you're up against Lingbane. You just want enough Marauders to create a little bit of a wall in front of your units, use their concussive shells to slow down the front-running wave of Lingbane, and to hopefully get a lot of Lingbane clump up around them and have your Widow Mines just feast on that beautiful, beautiful clump of Lingbane. So Marine to Marauder, normally the standard way to build up your production, and this kind of goes for all matchups, but especially here in ZvT, is to get 1 Tech Lab on your first barracks, and then to get 4 reactors on your next 4 barracks. So on your 2 base production, on 5 barracks, you get out that 1 Tech Lab, 4 reactors, and then once you get up your 3rd base saturated, you add 3 more barracks to go to 8 barracks total, and you would normally add 3 Tech Labs. However, this game is kind of interesting, and you can see it in the production tab. If we go back especially to this point, it's like, whoa, look at that production tab in the top left. You can see that Innovation is actually regularly building only 2 Marauders at this point, even though he's actually going up to a 4th, and 12 Marines at a time. So Innovation did a cool change up in this game, and he actually went for 6 reactors and only 2 Tech Labs. He went super Marine heavy here. So this is a bit of an adjustment, and it's something which you don't see very often. So what does this really change up in his style? Well, he's got more Marines, which means more firepower. It means he's going to be a little bit stronger at gunning down the Lingbane. However, he is going to be a lot weaker once Ultralisks come out at actually engaging the Ultralisks front on, and has to instead do a lot of multi-prong dropping and gunning down drones with that high damage output of the Marines, but can't actually stand and fight the Ultras in a front-on fight very well. He ends up being really pressed up against the wall and barely winning this game because Solar attacks really far off creep with only a few Ultralisks versus a huge Bio army. So let's talk a little bit about that Widow Mine kind of verse Lingbane and how that kind of interacts in order to understand this Marine Marauder kind of ratio just a little bit better. So I'm actually going to show you guys a little bit of my, I believe this was daily number 17. Yep, how to get better micro. And this is where I was talking a bit about Marine and Widow Mine micro. And I'm talking about how if your Widow Mines are kind of spread out in front of your army, they tend to just kind of waste their shots for the most part on front-running Zerglings. This scenario doesn't show it exactly perfectly. Of course, this is a very fake scenario. But you could see that because there was no Marines on top of those no Marines on top of those front running mines, the mines simply fire on the first thing that comes their way. However, what you really want is you want enough firepower to gun down any spread out Zerg units at the front. So the Widow Mines, rather than shooting, say, a single Zergling at the front and then just wasting their shot and maybe even dealing friendly fire, you want that Widow Mines to wait until the big clumps of Banelings roll in, and that's where you want to be doing the damage. So that's why actually having a high enough ratio of Marines with your Widow Mines is completely integral to making sure this works. So usually when it comes to the Marine Marauder count, if the Zerg isn't particularly high level and doesn't micro well, maybe you can just expect him to A move, and he's going to clump up around your heavy Marauder count and screw it up. But once you get to players microing their Lingbane correctly and running the Banelings past towards the Marines, you need to have a lot of Marines, and you need to stand them right up on front of these Widow Mines to ensure that they're actually going to do the job. See here, these Widow Mines, they should have more Marines out in front of them. These Widow Mine shots are not great because of that. They do decently because the Terran outnumbers the Zerg by about 500 times. But they definitely could do a lot better. So this time, you're going to see me kind of change up the formation of those Marines, move them in front of the Widow Mines, and this time the aim is to gun down those front-running units. So you've got to make sure you've got plenty of Marines. Innovation, by going for that 6-reactor, 2-tech lab composition, actually really focused on being able to do that and making sure that he was going to gun down any small numbers of Lingbane, not let his Widow Mines fire for nothing. Now, if you don't have enough Marines, you do end up also spending most of your time running away from the Banelings, splitting. We saw there the Marines weren't splitting and running away, but that's obviously bad. Even though people, go crazy about amazing splits, most of the time a Terran player doesn't want to be splitting and running. Most of the time the Terran player would rather have their Marines standing and shooting and gunning things down. So normally it would be 4 reactors, 4 reactors, and then 4 tech labs once you get up to your 8 barracks. But in that scenario, it was actually 6 reactors, 2 tech labs. That's a cool way you can adjust that. But let's talk more about the Widow Mines then. We talked there about how you need enough Marines to complement the Widow Mines. Just in general, you can also go 2 factory Widow Mines if you so choose. You could add a second factory, get tunneling claws, and actually just kind of pump out 3 Widow Mines at a time, go crazy. Similar to the Marine style though, it's going to be, yes, you've got a lot of Widow Mines, you can afford to waste a few more shots, but it's going to be really tough once Ultralisks come out, because Widow Mines, they do damage to Ultralisks, but it's really not supply or cost-efficient damage. It's going to take like 5 Widow Mine shots to kill an Ultra, and that's significantly more supply and money than the Ultralisk costs. Let's take a look at a few more VODs here. So Widow Mines are normally what you add to your bio against Lingbane, but what if you're playing against Roach Ravager? What if you're going to be playing against that? That's where things get kind of interesting. Let's and that's usually where you want to add tanks to your composition. This is a game from DreamHack Valencia. It is Liquid Bunny versus Liquid Snoot here. Game 1 on Galactic Process from, I believe, the round of 32 of that. And Bunny, you can see already adding a second factory in that production tab in the top left. And if we skip forward about 2 minutes in this game, we can see that he does this huge Marine tank push with his 2-2 upgrades down here into the Roach Ravager, really using the cliffs to his advantage and just tearing apart the Roach Ravager really well, just poking in and forcing Snoot to take a bad fight against him. So, generally speaking, it's kind of set why tanks are good against this. If you don't have tanks, the Roach Ravager actually outranges your bio. They can pick away at any Widow Mines from afar. They can land good fungals and corrosive biles. It's just really hard to fight against Roach Ravager without tanks. You can make it happen with pure bio. There are some games where that does happen, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But for now, you can see that it kind of forces the Zerg to take one big set engagement. The Zerg can't dance in and out, spamming corrosive bile over and over again. So you force the Zerg to take one big engagement, and if you've got good enough positioning using ledges and the spread and everything, and you dodge the corrosive biles on the tanks, then you can win just like in this game. So those double factory tank pushes are fantastic. Some players prefer to just stay on single factory, go up to the 8 barracks a bit sooner, get that 4 Marauder production at a time going, and that can make a big difference. Speaking of the Marine Marauder ratio, well, if you're playing against Roach Ravager, surely Marauders are a stronger unit. Wouldn't you want to be adding in some more Marauders? This is something where the thing is, Marines are such a good general purpose unit. They're so flexible that a lot of the time, especially if you go double factory tank, notice how these players are still very focused on Marines. It's partly because it's very hard to afford enough gas for both a big Marauder count and a big siege tank count while keeping up your medevac production. It's also something because they still want that very flexible number of Marines in their army in case their opponent does add a lot of Zerglings in with, say, one of these Ravager Ling Infestor styles. So you definitely could add, say, an extra tech lab, adjust that Marauder ratio a little bit, but it's very rare you'll see it at pro play. So I want anyone who thinks about doing that to be very kind of careful. If you want to raise your Marauder count, say your first 5 barracks, the absolute maximum against Zerg is usually a second tech lab. I would say if you're Diamond League or below, you maybe could go a third tech lab because your opponents aren't going to have the most amazing micro. You can go for a really Marauder heavy composition and rely on them kind of, rolling Banelings into it. Or in the case of Roach Ravager, the Marauders, they're going to get some pretty good value as long as you've got decent concaves and you don't get them all fungal and corrosive biled altogether. All right, so that's generally the main things for Terran, guys. Essentially, it's just adjusting your ratio of Marine Marauder, choosing tanks or Widowmines. What about Hellbats? Well, Hellbats are kind of decent. At lower levels, they're amazing. They're fantastic. As long as you spread your units well. And the reason is, especially against Ling Bane, I mean, obviously against Roach Ravager, they're not good. But against Ling Bane, they can be fantastic if you spread well and your opponent doesn't have enough Banelings, because Hellbats roast Zerglings. They destroy Zerglings so badly. However, what you'll find, and I'm going to talk more about this from the Zerg side, well, I guess I might as well mention it now. What about Zerg countering Hellbats? All you do is make more Banelings. Spend less gas on things like Mutalisks. Make sure you've got enough Banelings with your Ling Bane composition to just roll over and just instantly kill the Hellbats. As long as you instantly kill the Hellbats, suddenly there's no splash damage left over. It's not like Widow Mines, where pre-spread out Widow Mines, the Zerg can't just instantly kill those at the start of a fight. To do so, they'd end up tanking Widow Mine shots from the other Widow Mines that are spread out. So even with spread out Hellbats, the problem is that they're standing above the surface, they're easy to see, your Banelings will just roll over, kill them instantly, they'll get one shot off each, and then even if it's a cost-inefficient trade at that point, the opponent is stuck with just Marines and Marauders, no splash damage against a big Ling Bane force, and the Ling Bane just rolls over the top. And this is something we saw time and time again in late Heart of the Swarm. Flash was obsessed with trying to make Hellbats work. He was like, they're so good against Zerglings, I'm going to use them. And there were so many games where players turned around massive advantages that he had. Sue vs. Flash is a famous series, which I wish I actually had the VOD now, because this just popped into my head as a good example of why Hellbats are bad. There were games where Flash would kill 30 drones with his first pressure, and then still end up losing or barely winning by the skin of his teeth, because Sue would just make a crazy number of Banelings, and the Hellbats could never get those big value shots the same way Widow Mines will. Alright guys, so that's the Terran side of things in terms of those are all your common compositional adjustments. You can go 1 factory tanks and more bio, you can go 2 factory and really focus it around one big spread out push like we saw Bunny do on Galactic Process. Generally those are your 2 options against Roach Ravager, and against Ling Bane it is always adding in mines, potentially Hellbats, but usually just mines, and potentially doing something crazy like Innovation did and going 6 reactor and going for a really high Marine count. Though I do feel like he was probably only doing that because it's Apotheosis and it's kind of an awkward map anyway, so he said, let's just play the mobility game, let's really try to smash you before Ultras get out. So let's talk a little bit about the Zerg side of things, guys. Roach Ravager or Ling Bane? I get asked this question all the time. People come to me and they say, what is the trigger that makes you choose to go Ling Bane or Roach Ravager? I'm watching your games or I'm watching Dark's games. I can't figure out what makes these players decide if they're going to go Ling Bane or Roach Ravager. And the answer is simple. There's no trigger. People decide before the match based on the map or their own preference. Most players, even pro players, simply choose one style, which they say, this is my preferred style. I'm going to focus on being really good with this style. And as long as I can get really good with this, I can make it work just about anywhere, as long as I adjust it accordingly. So these are both solid styles. It's not like one counters something and the other counters something else. Roach Ravager and Ling Bane, both solid bases to your army. The important thing is to understand how to adjust and tweak those compositions based on the situation. So these are your two core compositions as Zerg. Let's talk about when you're fighting Mutiling Baneling. We just talked there about Hellbats. You just need a super heavy Baneling count, allows your Lings to roll over everything else. You want to make sure your Zerglings aren't engaging in front of your Banelings, so all your Zerglings die and then your Banelings come in. You've kind of got to engage all at once, and because there's no big splash damage, it's one of the few situations where there's no risk of having your units all balled up or two big balls coming from either side of their army. And it allows you to really focus on that. Mines. Let's go back to that VOD of innovation versus solar while we talk about mines now from the Zerg perspective. What if your opponent's adding in a lot of Widow Mines, or even just a decent amount of Widow Mines? Well, remember, we are talking about if you're going Mutiling Baneling. So just spreading your army every time you engage and actively spreading forward with your Ling Bane is big here. You know, spreading the Zerglings through their army to try to pull Widow Mine shots, but that's micro. That's not a compositional adjustment. But what allows you to do that micro and what allows you to deal with those Widow Mines is adjusting the ratio of Zerglings to Banelings. Now, I don't have necessarily the absolute best example here. He's kind of rolling in 50% Zerglings, 50% Banelings. But what Sol is actually doing is committing mostly to the counterattack in the top left. He's rolling a lot of Zerglings in over and over again. I think that was the Baneling roll-in that he just did there, but he keeps on counterattacking and going for a much higher Zergling than Baneling ratio. And that's what you want to be going for, guys, is at least 3 Zerglings to every Baneling, potentially even a lot higher. You really only need enough Banelings to come in behind your Zerglings and kill any big clumps of Marines and force the Marines to kind of spread out. The reason is you need lots of Zerglings so you've got plenty to pull those Widowmine shots into your opponent's force so that you can throw away a few Zerglings. Whereas the more Banelings you have, the more they're naturally going to clump up in these big balls that are going to roll in slowly behind the battle. And that's always really uncomfortable. Like watching those Banelings come in these like big balls, and that's where the magic Widowmine shots happen. So that's a really, really big one. And that also is kind of the same thing against siege tanks. You know, it's not something we see at pro level ever, but I do get asked a lot, how do I beat Marine tank with my Ling Baneling? And the answer is, once again, have a lot more Zerglings than Banelings. Whenever you're dealing with a big splash damage unit, you want to just have more Zerglings. You want to pre-spread, flank if you can, because these things minimize the splash damage and because you can just get on top of their army so damn fast with those Zerglings. So the more you spread out and the higher the Zergling ratio becomes, the better you can counter both Widowmine and siege tank compositions. What about Thors and Liberators? If you're building Lingbane Muta, how do you adjust if you see Thors joining the field or Liberators? It's kind of the same for both, in that you'd really rather have Corruptors rather than Mutalisks once they get up to a decent amount of these. A single Thor in a fight, well, you can deal with it. A single Liberator or two, you can deal with it. However, as things go later, usually you want to be stopping building Mutalisks and only building Corruptors for your anti-air from that point. A lot of players put a kind of self-imposed cap on themselves because they know how powerful, especially the Liberators are. They say, never ever build more than about 14, maybe 15 Mutalisks, unless I'm doing crazy damage with them, because, of course, you know, I don't want to just run into 4 Liberators, have them all pop when I'm not looking. I don't want to over-invest in that. So Corruptors are really good. The one exception where you can stay on mutas is if you're already doing a fantastic amount of damage. That's about it, guys. Just adjust the Ling-Bane ratio, be careful how you engage, spread creep well. The whole point of these core compositions is they kind of provide you a good basis to defend against just about everything. It's more about macro and everything else. And while the compositional adjustments and unit counters are important, there's something where it's always about a little shift in this direction or a shift in that direction, unless your opponent's doing something bizarre. I guess I'll stop for just a moment and say, well, what if your opponent just makes siege tanks and only siege tanks, or just makes this unit? In those cases, you do need to react a bit harder to it. The thing is, this is not something which is technically good, because those are the very rare situations where you can just hard counter their army. If your opponent only builds siege tanks, well, you can just kill them with pure Zerglings. You'll get on top of them so fast. If your opponent only builds Marauders, same thing, Zerglings. You know, if they only build Hellions and Hellbats, you can counter it with Roaches. These are your very basic unit counters, which I'm not spending too long explaining today, but they are still quite important. Nonetheless, let's talk a little bit here about Roach Ravager now. because Roach Ravager is the next part, which we need to talk about. So if you are playing Roach Ravager, well, this is Dark versus Bomber, a game from Pro League all the way back from, I believe, April or July this year. I think it was April, yeah, a long time ago. And Dark plays a Roach Ravager style, plays it a bit lighter on the Roach Ravager, and goes straight into Ultras, and then actually starts swapping back into Ling Bane as well. And he's actually playing against a very odd situation here, which is just pure bio from Bomber. Bomber did a fast third command center opening, crazy macro. And even though you can't see the game time, this is only like 8 minutes 30 or 9 minutes into the game, and Bomber is maxed out with 8 Marauders and 63 Marines. And he kind of just rolls over the top here. So this is a question I get asked a lot. What if you're playing against bio with Roach Ravager? Or even what if you're playing against pure bio like this with no other support? And a lot of players say, I need to add Banelings, right? But whenever I add Banelings, it doesn't work. It doesn't help. The answer is not to add Banelings. And this replay is fantastic for talking about this concept because a lot of people look at this and say, well, Dark was clearly trying to get Banelings to counter the bio. But that would be incorrect. He was actually making that Baneling nest and that Baneling speed because this was a point so long ago in the meta where Zergs just were so used to Ultralisks killing everything and Terrans not being able to respond that Dark had this idea that, hey, I've already got 4 or 5 Ultralisks out. I'm going to be safe. You can't kill me. Let's make Banelings to counter the ghosts. Because the Banelings will crash into the ghosts, set off their area detonation with their suicide blast, and that will interrupt the ghost's snipe ability, which will allow him to, interrupt the snipes, give the Ultras time to get on top of the ghosts and then win. So Dark was already thinking one step too far ahead in this situation with this late game Baneling swap. And what you noticed in those big fights is he just didn't have enough of any of the units. So he lands some sick fungals, but doesn't have enough corrosive bile to fully capitalize on it. You see there? He runs out of corrosive bile. He doesn't even kill all the units that were fungled. He's got some Banelings, but he doesn't have enough Banelings to overwhelm. So he's committed a little bit too much in multiple directions. So normally, guys, do not add Banelings. Do not change up your composition if your opponent goes bio and you're going Roach Ravager. Roach Ravager is a strong base composition. You do not need to change it. You simply need to adjust it ever so slightly. The first thing is more fungal is fantastic. Imagine a few more fungal growths here. Oh, it would have been amazing. But not just that, more Roach Ravager, so that you've got more Roaches to absorb the damage in front of you, add out a little bit of damage, and most importantly, more Ravagers to spam corrosive bile on top of those fungals and kill all the medevacs and bio units underneath. Oh, whoops. I accidentally just skipped to another VOD. My bad. So killing them with an attack. What am I talking about? Oh, so if you're playing against pure bio as well, another thing to consider is because you do have the Roach advantage, even without Infestors, sometimes you can win with just Roach Ravager. This is back to daily number 12, How to Beat a Stronger Player, where I talk about opening muters to try and force your opponent to not build tanks and to go into things like mines, liberators, and bio, and then to just kill them with a big Roach Ravager all in. So this is a game which I'm sure Iagaz is sick of me showing by now. But I always refer to this to show the advantage Roach Ravager has over bio, and that is the range advantage I was talking about earlier. If there's no siege tanks, Roach Ravager can stop the bio from fighting where it wants to. Notice the corrosive biles are always spread out over where the bio wants to stand, so the bio has to constantly adjust its position and spend its time moving rather than shooting constantly. And whenever he gets a good position, I can pull back, drop corrosive biles, and he has to spend about 50% of the fighting time dodging corrosive bile or moving into the middle of my concave in a big clunky ball rather than actually having the correct positioning. And as a result, I can actually overwhelm him here. Eventually, notice I constantly just go forward, go back, and without tanks, you can outrange them. So if your opponent doesn't get siege tanks, sometimes just killing them with mass Roach Ravager is also the answer. So sometimes you can do it without the Infestors, but if you're playing into the later stages, and as they get a bigger and bigger bio army, you definitely need that fungal growth added in there. And eventually, obviously, want to add those Ultras or those Broodlords. So if you aren't playing against this sort of composition, what if you are playing against siege tanks with Roach Ravager? How do you adjust your composition? How do you adjust the way that you play against that? Well, the first thing is less Infestors. We see here, I just got to push my way in. I've got that range advantage. However, you're playing against siege tanks. Suddenly, you're not going to have that range advantage quite as much. I can go back to the games from earlier, Snoop versus Bunny and these sort of ones, and you can see that what it forces here is Infestors can't just come in and pick off units. Because if they do, the tanks are going to siege them down. Normally, the Infestors, the Ravagers, can poke in, pick off some units, pull back. kind of take these like half engages if you've got that range advantage. Roach Ravager suddenly can like really, pull back out of a bad position and then move back in. Pull back, move in. And kind of take these advantageous trades. As soon as you add the siege tanks here, notice that Snoot here, he keeps bleeding out damage to that tank range, and he's forced to attack with one big, huge engagement. So you can't invest in infestors as much. You need to invest more in the meaty core of Roach Ravager in your army, and you need to flank your opponent and come in with one big decisive engagement in a good position. So when you're fighting against heavy siege tanks as Zerg, it becomes more about having just enough meat in your army to overwhelm them in one go. And while Fungal can still be useful, your infestors can only come in behind your Roach Ravager or they'll get blasted down. So as a result, it's all about having enough Roach Ravager in front to just overwhelm everything. Of course, a good Ravager count is fantastic because Ravagers don't have an armored tag. I know that might change in a few weeks' time with the balance patch, so that might be outdated by the time some of you people are watching this video. But generally speaking, more Ravagers is also good because Corrosive Bile forces the siege tanks to pick up and move, or it just kills them if they're a bit slow on the moving. And even just forcing them to move will slow down the rate of fire on those siege tanks. All right, so only when you get to a crazy siege tank count is it really at the point where siege tanks really counter Roach Ravager. If your opponent gets up to 10, 12 siege tanks, things do get awkward usually, and it can be like, well, this does actually just counter my army. In that scenario, though, you've had plenty of time to get out Hive Tech. So you either kill the Terran before they get the crazy siege tank count, or you get to Hive Tech and you add in Broodlords, a fantastic transition off Roach Ravager. Some people prefer... Some people prefer Ultralisks. Excuse me. So let's finish up this VOD, guys. Last topic, and then I'll quickly answer a few questions as I've already gone longer than I did intend to. Very quickly, we're going to talk about mech. So mech is something which is not very common in the meta, but it's worth mentioning just a little bit. So let's go over the basics of mech very quickly. Another esports TV VOD, this one from Kesper Cup. This is of TY versus True, where he played a very almost Hotsesk style of mech, where it was very siege tank focused, very Hellion focused. So guys, if you're playing mech as a Terran player, you've got your Hellions to deal with Zerglings and Banelings. Your tanks are there to keep you alive against early mid-game pressure. Things like big Roach Ravager pushes, because tanks are the only efficient way to keep you alive against that. Sure, Thors are decent, Cyclones are decent against those units, but because they don't have splash damage, you'll never be able to deal with a massive Roaches swelling out of Zerg with them, which is why you always build this big siege tank count. However, what you'll notice here is as the game progresses, siege tanks just aren't a versatile or mobile enough unit. They're really useless against Broodlords. They're kind of pretty bad against Ultras. And your opponent's not going to be building those early game Roach Ravager units that, they were earlier. So as the game progresses, if I zoom on through a few minutes, we see siege tank production actually halts in that production tab. And as the game gets later and later, notice how the army is almost pure Thors here. And he's actually decided to add in a good count of Widow Mines as well, because Widow Mines very good for helping to kill Corruptors. So they help protect your Liberators. He had a pretty sick Liberator count before. He has lost most of them at this point. And he's playing mostly Thor Hellbat Widowmine. The idea, though, is, and I've got a good quote from Iaguz because I was talking to him about this. He said, the reason why tanks are so essential early on is they're the only cost-efficient way to avoid dying of Roaches. He said, but once you've got a big enough economy and enough mechy units, you can beat any ground army with all that, without that many tanks. So you really don't need them. You just want to get better quality, more flexible units. It's still nice to have a few siege tanks to pick away at your opponent's creep, have that nice range advantage, shoot down infestors before they get in range, but that's about it. So that's your standard sort of mech. Let's talk about the other type of mech very quickly, and this is the only replay I actually have today as well. Oh my god. And this is Daishi vs. a laser just from the Challenge Wars, actually, which me and Fear Dragon cast the other day. And Daishi actually goes for this really cool style of Sky Terran mech. With this style, it's a little bit different. Liberators are Banshees and Hellions are your harassment early on. They provide a lot of aggressive potential, but they're also... Banshees are your anti-ground units. Hellbats are your anti-Zergling and Baneling units. So your Banshees help keep you safe. As time goes on, Banshees aren't as good when your opponent can have things like Hydralisks with Overseers. So you start to add in range Liberators. And, range Liberators end up being your full anti-ground focus. And then as your opponent builds things like Corruptors to counter those, you build Vikings and Widow Mines to help counter these Corruptors. What we're going to see here is you need that kind of complex grouping of all the units in order to make the puzzle work. But unfortunately, Daishi doesn't quite get time to get all those anti-air units together. He's got great anti-ground, but not enough anti-air. He doesn't have any Vikings out yet. And so the Corruptors come in here, and they manage to take down all of these Liberators. The Widow Mines try to come into support, but too many expensive Liberators do go down. And just generally, if you do go to late game with either mech style, if your opponent gets enough Broodlords and goes Sky Terran, you want lots of ranged Liberators, lots of Vikings, but you add in a lot of Ghosts for that Snipe as well. I'm not really showing any VODs of Snipe today because I do feel like they're very hard to use, and usually the Terran player wants to be getting more of an advantage and an edge before that point. One of the big problems as the game goes later is because of Vipers and then eventually Sky Zerg, the Terran player normally feels a sort of impetus to go and either kill the opponent or to just turtle up like crazy and build planetaries everywhere and play it exceptionally slowly. So often with this style of Sky Terran, you are a little bit weak, you're a little bit inflexible. So you rely on those Hellions, Liberators, and Cloaked Banshees constantly counterattacking and harassing your opponent to distract and buy you enough time so that they don't come in and hit you in those weak points. In these games, a laser tended to always find the weak point where he'd just roll in with enough Roach Ravager Zergling and just barely enough Corruptors on the top. He'd always either crush the ground army or crush the air army. And then eventually, Daishi couldn't reproduce fast enough and couldn't keep all of the pieces of his army together enough to make that work. So guys, that is that. How do you counter mech finally to finish off? As Zerg, basically you just go Roach Hydra Viper. Roach Hydra Viper counters everything. Vipers are amazing, they just yank units in. Here is Bjol versus TY from earlier in the year where we see a good example versus Sky Terran, where he just comes forward with the Vipers and just yanks all of these Liberators into his army. Absolutely brutal. And he just hold positions his Hydras outside of the freedom zones and just rips those guys away. Picks away at them really cost efficiently. Even if you lose some Hydras, remember the Liberators, the air units are so much more expensive. The important thing there though is he always pulls his Vipers back after he uses them because they're the one thing he doesn't want to lose because they're so damn gas heavy. Let's look at another engagement from that same game where we also see he adds Infestors in. Against Sky Terran especially and super late game Terran, you add the Fungal, you land the Fungal plus Parasitic Bomb combo, and it just decimates air units super hard. Notice he always turns around when he's out of the freedom zones, and he's going to use that hold position micro with these Hydras. Even though all his Vipers are gone now, he did so much damage with his Spellcasters to the air units, and lands another Fungal on all those Vikings. And, just takes these trades over and over again, where it's not like he outright kills the Terran army, but the Terran units are more expensive, and just rushing up to Vipers and responding with that allows him to slap down the mech force. So, guys, that brings us to the end of today's topics that are pre-planned. Did go a bit longer than I planned to, as it always does, but that's all right. I'll answer a question or two really quickly if there's any good ones. Looks like there's none in chat, so I'm going to answer one question that came through on Twitter. Where was it? He says, when can I use Thors and are battle cruisers ever acceptable? Well, at the highest levels of play, not really. We don't see either of those units fitting a role right now. However, if you could somehow slow the game down enough, secure enough bases, technically, battle cruisers with a Yamato cannon are always going to be really good in a stalemate scenario because the Yamato cannon has excellent range and you can just snap a unit for free. Snap a unit for free. Also, now having teleport means if you can sneak them across the map, snipe a base, and teleport home, that's pretty sick. What I often see in my own ladder games is a player will, after winning a fight, he will teleport a BC to each of my expansions and just try to kill a lot of drones. Sometimes it's worthwhile in a messy enough situation where I can't really absorb those drone losses, but usually I'm already under the gun at that point, which is why it's effective. Did I wash my shirt? That's 2 days in a row, says Parantu. Good point. No, I don't give a shit. I wore it around the house in the morning. That's it, man. No F's given. No F's given, man. All right, guys. So thank you very much for hanging out. I do really appreciate it. I don't think there's any other relevant questions. There's other sort of weird compositions and stuff, but we really talked about the little adjustments that you make with all the regular compositions and how you counteract your opponent's army. So if you guys watch the YouTube video, down in the YouTube description below, there's a link to the Team Liquid thread. Go to the most recent page of it. You'll find all of the notes to this episode, all of the YouTube links, timestamped and everything. Like, Go check it out. You can watch through all the VODs and really kind of absorb these little adjustments that these players make. For now, I appreciate all you guys watching. Don't forget to hug a watermelon, kick a walrus, and of course, punch a cactus to the moon. I'll catch you guys next time. Goodbye and good night. For you guys watching